In late November 2025, a bombshell Bloomberg report sent shockwaves through Washington, Brussels, and Moscow. The world's most powerful capitals were suddenly united by a single emotion: disbelief. Overnight, the global order was thrown into chaos as the story broke across every major news outlet, igniting a firestorm of speculation and fear. The report included intercepted audio and transcripts of secret calls, exposing high-stakes, back-channel negotiations between the US, Russia, and European leaders. These weren't just routine diplomatic exchanges, they were the kind of conversations that could alter the course of history, revealing the raw mechanics of international power. The subject was nothing less than a desperate peace deal to end the war in Ukraine. For months, the world had watched the conflict grind on, but few knew just how close the parties were to a fragile agreement, until now. The leaks revealed raw, unfiltered conversations between President Trump's aide, Stephen Witkoff, and top Kremlin officials. These exchanges, never meant for public ears, laid bare the true stakes and the personal dynamics at play. These weren't formal talks, they were the real, unvarnished negotiations, far from public scrutiny. In these shadowy corridors of power, deals were brokered in whispers, and trust was a rare commodity. The content confirmed the worst fears. Peace was being dictated by Moscow, with Western concessions once thought unthinkable. The balance of power was shifting, and the world was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about who really held the cards. The leak didn't just reveal secrets, it shattered the carefully maintained secrecy of the process. Suddenly, the invisible lines of diplomacy were exposed for all to see, and the illusion of control was gone. Governments scrambled to control the narrative, but the audio was undeniable. The world could hear the tension, the bargaining, and the desperation in every word. The public heard powerful men treating Ukraine's fate as a bargaining chip. For many, it was a chilling reminder of how ordinary lives are shaped by decisions made behind closed doors. The talks weren't about justice or law, they were about power, leverage, and ending a draining conflict at any cost. Principles were set aside for pragmatism, and the human cost was weighed against political gain. The timing was critical. The leak hit just as negotiations reached their final, most delicate stage. Every word, every pause, now carried the weight of global scrutiny, threatening to unravel months of progress. Suddenly, a secret process became a global spectacle, and leaders were forced to face the consequences in the harsh light of public scrutiny. The world's attention was relentless, and the pressure on negotiators was immense. The world was watching, and the price of peace was now impossible to hide. In that moment, the fate of nations hung in the balance, and history was being rewritten in real time. The secrecy around the 2025 peace talks was simple. The terms were politically toxic. Leaders knew the concessions would be seen as a betrayal of Ukraine and a capitulation to Russian aggression. For years, the public was told Ukraine's fight was for democracy and sovereignty. But the secret talks abandoned those ideals for a quick, compromised peace. Admitting the truth would have triggered mass protests, votes of no confidence, and possibly toppled governments. The secrecy was a shield, meant to protect leaders from public outrage and to present the deal as a fait accompli. The talks also exposed deep divisions within the West, some desperate to end the war, others seeing any concession as an existential threat. Above all, leaders feared the moment they'd have to explain why the price of peace was being paid by someone else. At the heart of the secret talks was a relentless ticking clock, Russia's uncompromising 48-hour ultimatum, a deadline that loomed over every conversation and every decision. Moscow made its intentions unmistakably clear: sign a deal within 2 days, or the fragile negotiations would collapse in an instant, leaving chaos in their wake. The threat was explicit and chilling. If talks failed, Russia would unleash a massive new offensive, redrawing borders by force and plunging the region into fresh turmoil. The deadline transformed diplomacy into a high-stakes hostage situation, with peace itself held captive and every negotiator feeling the weight of the world on their shoulders. The Kremlin's strategy was calculated, exploiting Western war weariness and the Trump administration's deep desire to end what it saw as endless, costly wars. There was no time for debate, no room for protest. Leaders were forced to make impossible choices, weighing a deeply flawed peace against the specter of catastrophic war. Every hour that passed tightened the noose, as diplomats scrambled to find common ground, knowing that a single misstep could tip the world into disaster. The pressure only amplified divisions within the West, especially among Eastern European states haunted by memories of past invasions and betrayals. For some, the ultimatum was a terrifying echo of old traumas. For others, it was a nightmare scenario that had to be avoided at any cost, no matter the price. The 48-hour clock wasn't just a deadline, it was a countdown to a moment that threatened to shatter Western unity and plunge the world into uncertainty. As the final seconds ticked away, the world held its breath, watching and waiting, knowing that history could change in an instant as the clock ticked down. The most explosive revelation was Russia's non-negotiable demand: full Western recognition of all Ukrainian territories it had seized since 2022, including Crimea. This wasn't a ceasefire or frozen conflict, it was a demand to legitimize the largest forcible land grab in Europe since World War II. Accepting it would tear up the post-war rulebook and set a dangerous precedent: military aggression rewarded, conquest normalized. In exchange, Russia offered only a ceasefire, partial troop withdrawal, and vague promises of autonomy for what remained of Ukraine. The fine print: Russia would keep a heavy military presence in annexed regions, turning them into fortified outposts. Ukraine would be left dismembered and permanently weakened. The deal looked less like peace and more like surrender, enshrining the sacrifice of Ukrainian sovereignty in international law. This was the terrifying price of peace, a new map of Europe drawn by force. Russia's demand for territory sent shockwaves through NATO and the EU, exposing deep divisions. Powerful Western nations, including the US, leaned toward accepting the deal to end the war and pivot away from Europe. Eastern European states, haunted by history, saw the deal as existential appeasement. They argued that legitimizing Russia's conquests would only embolden the Kremlin and put them next in line. Furious arguments erupted behind closed doors. Eastern Europeans accused the West of betrayal. The alliance faced a terrible choice: defend sovereignty and risk wider war, or accept a new, unstable reality. This internal conflict was exactly what Russia wanted, forcing the West to turn on itself. The unity of NATO and the EU was now at risk, perhaps an even greater prize for Moscow than land. The leaked audio of Trump aide Stephen Witkoff revealed a shocking alignment with the Kremlin. In calls with top Russian officials, Witkoff coached them on how to frame proposals to appeal to Trump's America First agenda. He advised the Russians on navigating U.S. politics and bypassing opposition from the State Department and Pentagon. The tapes confirmed critics' worst fears. A key U.S. negotiator was working in concert with Moscow, not for a just peace. Russian officials spoke of Witkoff as a reliable partner, not an adversary. The fallout was immediate, proof of a pro-Russian bias at the highest levels of the U.S. government. Kremlin aide Ushakov was forced to partially confirm the tape's authenticity. The lines between negotiator and collaborator had blurred, undermining America's position. As the world reeled, one question dominated: who leaked the talks? Bloomberg protected its source, but speculation ran wild. The leading theory: a faction within U.S. intelligence, horrified by the deal, leaked the tapes to sabotage it. Others pointed to European or Ukrainian agencies, desperate to stop a deal that would doom Ukraine and threaten their own security. Some even suggested a Russian power struggle, though most analysts dismissed this. Whoever the leaker, the act was a deliberate attempt to derail the negotiations and force the issue into the open. The leak became a geopolitical event, a weapon in the information war. It changed the course of history before the ink could dry. The leaks shattered secrecy and unleashed a wave of public fury. Protests erupted across Europe: Berlin, Paris, Warsaw, citizens condemning the secret deal and demanding accountability. In the U.S., Congress erupted in outrage, calling for Witkoff's dismissal and investigations into the administration's actions. The controversy paralyzed Washington and created a political crisis for President Trump. European leaders faced similar backlash, accused of duplicity and weakness. In Eastern Europe, opposition parties seized on the leaks as proof of betrayal. The public demanded transparency and a return to the principles that had guided the West's response to the war. The leaks forced a public debate on the ethics of the deal. Citizens became active participants, not just observers. Widespread opposition made it nearly impossible for leaders to sign such a controversial agreement. As of December 15, 2025, Europe stands at a crossroads, its security and future in the balance. The choices made now will echo for decades, shaping not only the continent, but the world beyond. The stakes have never been higher, and the uncertainty is palpable across capitals and communities alike. If the deal goes through, it sets a dangerous precedent. Nuclear powers can invade, annex, and be legitimized. This would send shockwaves through the international order, undermining the very foundations of global security and diplomacy. Other nations may be emboldened to follow suit, believing that might makes right. This isn't lasting peace. It's an invitation for future conflicts and the possible unraveling of NATO and the EU. The alliances that have kept Europe stable for generations could fracture, leaving the continent exposed to new dangers and old rivalries. Eastern European members would feel abandoned, seeking new security arrangements and altering the continent's landscape for decades. Trust in collective defense would erode, and the search for new alliances could redraw the map of Europe. But if the deal collapses, the threat of a devastating new Russian offensive looms. The specter of war would return to Europe, with consequences that could spiral far beyond the region's borders. Leaders are trapped between a peace that feels like surrender and a war that could spiral out of control. Every decision is fraught with risk, and the margin for error is vanishingly small. The public must care. These negotiations will define the world we live in. Ordinary people, from students to business owners, will feel the impact of these choices in their daily lives, whether through security, prosperity, or the shadow of conflict. Are international law and sovereignty principles to defend, or relics to discard? The answer will determine whether justice and order prevail, or if power alone decides the fate of nations. The outcome will shape peace and security for generations. The hopes and fears of millions rest on what happens next, and history will remember the choices made in these critical days. The world is watching, waiting to see which path is chosen. In this moment, Europe's decision will resonate far beyond its borders, setting the tone for the future of international relations.